I've seen a lot in my years as a police investigator, but nothing prepared me for what I encountered when I went to the infamous Cave of Killers in Wayne National Forest, a place where locals whispered of horrors beyond belief. As a skeptic, I thought it was just a ghost story, something meant to scare people away from a remote, eerie corner of the woods. I was wrong. The journey began as any other investigation. A group of local hikers had recently gone missing in the area. Their last known location? The Cave of Killers, a spot with a history drenched in bloodshed. Rumors said that anyone who dared to enter would never return, and that the cave itself was cursed. My job was simple: find the missing people and debunk the myth, or uncover something more sinister. The first thing that struck me when I arrived was the silence. A heavy, oppressive quiet settled over the forest, as if even the trees were holding their breath. The air felt thick, and the usual sounds of wildlife were absent. It was disconcerting. I arrived at the cave at dusk, the forest's shadows growing long as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was a typical overcast day, but there was an unnatural stillness to the air. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the forest pressing in around me, and entered the cave with my flashlight illuminating the path ahead. The walls were jagged, the air damp, and the scent of mildew filled my nostrils. But there was something more, something I couldn't put my finger on. Inside the cave, I found remnants of past attempts at exploration: broken equipment, discarded food wrappers, and abandoned tools. There was no sign of the hikers, but there was a palpable sense of dread. It was as if the very walls of the cave were steeped in a darkness that no amount of light could penetrate. I could hear faint noises echoing around me, scratching sounds, almost like claws dragging across stone. As I ventured deeper, I noticed strange markings on the cave walls, scratches and symbols, some of which looked like they'd been carved recently. I couldn't make sense of them, but they weren't like anything I had seen before. Almost instinctively, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I wasn't alone. Just then I heard something. A low, guttural growl echoed through the cave, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Someone, or something, was down here with me. I reached for my gun, my breath shallow, but before I could even pull it out, the ground beneath me shook. The walls of the cave trembled, and a deep rumble echoed through the tunnels. I could feel it in my bones, a sensation so unnerving it felt as though the earth itself was alive. I decided to turn back, but it wasn't easy. The way I had come seemed different now, more labyrinthine, the paths twisting in ways I couldn't explain. The cave felt alive, shifting with every step I took. I could hear whispers now, voices faint but distinct. They didn't sound like human voices. They sounded otherworldly. In a moment of clarity, I realized that whatever was in that cave wasn't human. It was something much darker, and it wasn't interested in letting me leave. As I frantically retraced my steps, the growling became louder, and I felt eyes on me from all directions. The shadows around me seemed to grow, reaching out with unnatural speed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. There were flickers of movement in my peripheral vision, too fast for me to focus on, like some predatory creature stalking its prey. I finally found my way to the exit, but not before something heavy slammed into my back. The force of the blow knocked me to the ground, and I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding in my chest. When I turned to face whatever had attacked me, I saw nothing but the swirling shadows of the cave. My flashlight flickered and died. I ran. I don't know how I made it out alive, but I did. I stumbled out of the cave, gasping for breath, feeling the weight of unseen eyes still following me. When I reached the safety of my vehicle, I realized the truth. This place wasn't just a cave. It was a trap, a place that fed on fear, on life itself. The stories were true. The Cave of Killers was a real thing, and whatever lived inside had claimed far more than just hikers. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sounds, the whispers, and the growling followed me even as I sat in the safety of my home. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadows of the cave, creeping closer and closer. I never went back to Wayne National Forest after that, and I never will. The case remains unsolved. The missing hikers are still missing, and the cave still stands as a warning. Some things are better left alone, and some stories are true. I've learned that the hard way. There are some places that should never be explored. As a police investigator, I had always prided myself on my ability to stay calm in the face of danger. I'd faced high-speed chases, violent criminals, and even disasters. But when it came to the Cave of Killers in Wayne National Forest, I was out of my depth. I had spent years investigating murder cases, uncovering cold truths about the darker side of human nature. But the cave didn't seem to follow the rules of reality I'd come to know. This wasn't a place where logical thinking or law enforcement skills could save me. It was a place that thrived on fear, on a primal instinct that I could barely comprehend. The forest itself was a living thing, vast and ancient, stretching for miles deep into the Appalachian foothills. The trees towered overhead like silent sentinels, their trunks twisted and gnarled, as if the forest itself were watching. In the daylight, it was just another part of Ohio, a peaceful haven for hikers and outdoor enthusiasts. But as I would come to realize, the forest hid something much more sinister, a history of death and terror that had been covered up for decades. In the small town nearby, I had spoken to a few locals who reluctantly told me about the cave. Their stories were consistent, if not strange. People would go missing in the woods, never to return, and the cave would always be at the center of the mystery. Some claimed to have heard growls and whispers coming from the cave's entrance, while others spoke of seeing shadows moving within its depths. Most frightening of all were the stories of those who had ventured too far into the cave, never emerging again. The more I heard, the less inclined I was to believe these tales. My investigative mind told me it was all a series of tragic, but explainable, disappearances. Despite the warnings, I felt an undeniable pull toward the cave. I needed to know the truth. As a police investigator, my job wasn't just to solve crimes. It was to uncover the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. But as I stood at the entrance to the cave for the first time, flashlight in hand, I realized that some truths were better left buried. The character of the forest played as much of a role in the story as the people involved. The trees felt like ancient guardians, silent and unyielding, watching over their territory. They stood tall and motionless, blocking the sun in places and casting eerie shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The air was dense with the smell of damp earth and decay, as if the forest was slowly consuming anything that dared to venture within. I couldn't help but feel that there was something off about this place, something that existed far beyond the boundaries of the natural world. It was as if the forest itself were part of the curse, an ancient being protecting a secret, guarding a hidden darkness. I had come prepared, of course. As a seasoned investigator, I'd brought along all the necessary gear: a flashlight, a gun, a first aid kit, and a two-way radio to keep in contact with my team. But none of it mattered. As I descended deeper into the cave, I felt a growing sense of unease. The cave's labyrinthine tunnels twisted and turned in ways that defied logic. The walls felt closer, as if the very space itself was closing in around me. And the darkness, my flashlight barely pierced it. The shadows moved with a fluidity that shouldn't have been possible, as if they had a life of their own. The deeper I went, the less I could trust my senses. The shadows seemed to have weight, pressing against me from all sides. The air grew colder, the silence more oppressive. My own breath seemed too loud in the cavernous space, echoing off the stone walls in a way that made me feel as though I was being watched. I began to hear things, the soft scrape of stone against stone, like claws dragging across the floor. Whispers. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the result of too many stories, too many warnings. But as the whispers grew louder, more insistent, I knew it wasn't just in my head. There was something else in the cave with me. The real question was, what had brought it here? What had awakened it from its slumber? And most importantly, were there more of them? I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I realized that what I had just experienced wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. There were others out there, other creatures that had been waiting, hidden away in the corners of this vast wilderness. And I, in my arrogance and skepticism, had stumbled right into the heart of it. The government had sent me here to investigate, to eradicate the threat that had terrorized this region. But they didn't understand the scope of what I was dealing with. The reports, the rumors, the strange occurrences, they were all connected, tied to something much larger than a single creature. The truth was more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. I limped out of the cave, the pain in my body reminding me of the battle I had just fought. I felt the weight of what I had just done settling over me, but it wasn't the weight of victory. It was the weight of a truth I wasn't ready to face. The forest, with its beauty and its danger, was hiding secrets that no one had ever fully understood. And now I was part of that secret, whether I liked it or not. As I made my way back to civilization, my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and questions. What was the true nature of this creature? What were the forces behind it? And what would I do next? I couldn't shake the feeling that my involvement in this twisted saga wasn't over. The truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. But I knew one thing for sure. I would never be the same. My view of the world, of what was possible, had been irrevocably changed. I had stepped into a world where the lines between reality and nightmare blurred, and I had survived. But at what cost? I wasn't sure if I was ready to face the answers to the questions that haunted me now. But I knew one thing. The forest was still out there, and it had more secrets to reveal. And next time, I wouldn't be so lucky. Months passed since my encounter in the Wayne National Forest, but the memories still linger, haunting my every waking moment. I've tried to return to a normal life, but I can never forget what I saw in that cave. The whispers, the shadowy figures lurking at the edge of my vision, they still follow me. I've reported everything I know to the authorities, but I can't shake the feeling that the creature I encountered wasn't the only one. The forest holds more secrets, and I fear one day they will come for me again. The darkness never truly leaves. What happened in the Wayne National Forest is far from over. If you value your safety and the truth, don't ignore the warnings. The stories you hear about the Cave of Killers aren't just myths, they're real, and something far darker is lurking within the woods. Be cautious if you venture into these parts. Trust no one, not even yourself. If you've had any encounters or strange experiences near the cave or elsewhere in the forest, it's time to speak out. Your silence could be the very thing that lets the darkness grow. Share your story and help uncover the truth. The voices in my head began to rise in volume, a cacophony of screams, whispers, and unintelligible words. It was as if the cave itself was alive, feeding on my thoughts, my fear. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the sensation stopped. The creature pulled back, and the air seemed to settle. I was left standing there, trembling and disoriented, my flashlight flickering wildly in my hand. It was clear to me now that this wasn't just a matter of murder or criminal investigation. This was something beyond human comprehension, something older than civilization itself. It had been waiting for me, drawing me into its trap, and now that I was here, it wasn't going to let me go. But I wasn't entirely helpless. As I regained my composure, I remembered the survival training I had undergone. I had been in dangerous situations before, been face to face with killers, with criminals, but this was different. This wasn't a normal fight. This was something else entirely. The logical part of my brain told me to get out of the cave, to run, to leave it all behind. But the deeper part of me, the part that had been trained for moments like this, knew that there was only one choice left: confront it. The moment had arrived. There was no turning back now. The moment I confronted the creature, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The darkness in the cave felt alive, pressing in on me from all sides. Every part of my body screamed for escape, but I knew that running would only seal my fate. The creature, whatever it was, had already proven that it could reach into my mind, twisting it into a nightmare of memories and visions. I couldn't trust my instincts anymore, not when they were clouded by fear. I stood there, still, feeling the weight of its gaze upon me. The creature's eyes glowed faintly in the dark, the only source of light in the oppressive blackness. Its pale skin seemed to shimmer with an eerie, unnatural quality, as though the very air around it was distorting, bending to its will. My heart was hammering in my chest, my breath shallow and quick. I wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but the air seemed to thicken in my throat, choking my words before they could escape. For a long moment, nothing happened. It was as though the creature was waiting for me to make a move, to show it some sign of resistance or fear. I stood there, frozen, uncertain of what to do. My training, my years of experience in handling criminals in dangerous situations, meant nothing here. I had no weapons, no tools to defend myself. And yet, something in me knew I had to fight. Not just for my life, but for the truth that had eluded me all along. Then, as if sensing my resolve, the creature began to move. Slowly at first, with a deliberate slowness that seemed to mock my every breath, it advanced. Its steps made no sound on the rocky ground, but I felt the vibrations, each one reverberating in my bones. It was like the very cave was alive with its presence, the walls groaning under the strain of something ancient and terrible. The whispers in my head grew louder, filling my mind with fragmented images, each one more grotesque than the last. I instinctively took a step back, but it was no use. The creature closed the distance between us with terrifying speed, and before I could react, it was right in front of me. Its eyes bore into mine, the intensity of its gaze like a weight on my soul. I tried to lift my arm, to reach for my flashlight, but my body was stiff, paralyzed by a force greater than fear. The creature didn't speak, at least not with words. Instead, I felt its presence deep in my mind, its thoughts pressing against mine like an invasive force, wrapping itself around my consciousness. "You shouldn't have come," I heard in my mind, not in words, but in a deep, resonant voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I tried to scream, but the sound was lost in my throat. My head felt heavy, the weight of the creature's thoughts pressing down on me, drowning out my own. I felt myself losing control, my thoughts becoming cloudy, my body fighting against something it couldn't comprehend. It wasn't just the creature I was facing. It was the power that had created it, the ancient force that had watched over this place for centuries, if not millennia. It was as if I had stumbled into the very heart of something that should never have been disturbed. The legends, the whispers, the warnings, they were all true. This wasn't just a random killer or a figment of someone's imagination. This was something much darker, much older than I had ever expected. The creature seemed to be feeding on my fear, growing stronger with every passing second. It made no move to attack physically, but its presence was suffocating, overwhelming. I could feel the tendrils of its influence seeping into my mind, twisting my thoughts, corrupting my very sense of self. And then suddenly there was a shift. A crackling sound echoed through the cave, and the creature recoiled, its form rippling like water disturbed by a stone. It let out an almost imperceptible growl, as if something had intruded on its territory, something that it could not control. I didn't understand what was happening, but the oppressive weight on my chest lightened, just enough to allow me to take a breath. I realized then that I wasn't alone. There was something else in the cave with me, something hidden in the shadows, something I couldn't see but could feel. The air shifted again, and the creature hissed in agitation. It was as if a new player had entered the scene, one that even the creature feared. I didn't have time to process what was going on. The tension in the cave was unbearable, thick with anticipation. The creature was no longer focusing on me alone. Its attention was split between whatever new force had entered the cave and me. It was a moment of weakness, a crack in its otherwise impenetrable facade, and I knew this was my only chance. I dropped to the ground, my hand instinctively reaching for the ground to steady myself. As my fingers touched the stone, I felt it, something cold and solid beneath the surface, something that had been hidden for centuries. Without thinking, I pulled it free. A jagged rock, its surface covered in strange markings. It wasn't much, but it was the only weapon I had. I gripped it tightly, feeling a rush of adrenaline surge through me. The creature seemed to sense the shift in the air, and its eyes narrowed. It let out a low, guttural growl that reverberated through my body. I was ready now, my fear replaced by a primal instinct to survive. I didn't know what I was up against, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going down without a fight. The battle had only just begun. The consequences of my actions were far from clear, but I could feel the weight of what was to come. Whatever had brought me here, whatever was at work in this dark, cursed place, I was about to face it head on. And in the end, I would either uncover the truth or become another lost soul, forgotten in the shadows of Wayne National Forest. The darkness of the cave seemed to close in even tighter, suffocating me with its weight. My heart raced, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I gripped the jagged stone in my hand, knuckles white with tension. My breath was shallow, the air thick with an unseen presence, an unseen force that pressed in on me from all directions. The creature, that shadow of nightmare, was still lurking, its cold eyes fixated on me. But something had changed, something deep within me had shifted. The fear that had once paralyzed me, the fear that had threatened to overtake my every action, was starting to break. In that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about confronting something deeper, something that had been haunting me long before I set foot in this cursed forest. The creature was the manifestation of that darkness, the embodiment of the fears I had tried to suppress for years. I wasn't just battling it, I was battling myself, my own doubts and insecurities. I forced myself to breathe, steadying my shaking hands as the weight of the rock in my grip grounded me. My training as an investigator, my years spent chasing criminals and solving the mysteries of human behavior, had never prepared me for this. But in a strange way, it was those very skills that began to surface now. I had learned to observe, to think critically, to remain calm under pressure. This situation was no different, even if it was beyond the realm of anything I had ever faced. The creature's low growl echoed through the cave, a sound so primal that it sent a shiver down my spine. But instead of retreating, I found myself standing taller, my mind clearing. I realized then that I had underestimated the true power of fear. Fear isn't just something that paralyzes you. It's also something that can fuel you, drive you to act when nothing else would. It's a force that can either break you or make you stronger, depending on how you face it. The creature, too, had underestimated me. It thought it could control me, invade my mind, twist my perception of reality. It had tried to make me believe that I was powerless, that I was nothing in the face of its ancient, unfathomable presence. But it didn't know me. It didn't know the depths of my resolve, my determination to see things through, no matter the odds. I focused on the present moment, on the cold stone in my hand, on the soft echo of my breath in the cave. I could feel the weight of the creature's gaze on me, but I refused to let it dominate my thoughts any longer. I wasn't just some investigator who had stumbled into the unknown. I was someone who had spent years searching for answers, for meaning, for truths hidden beneath the surface. And I wasn't about to let this creature, or whatever it represented, take that away from me. Slowly, I raised the rock in front of me, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of my own willpower. I had come this far. I wasn't going to back down now. The creature circled me, its movements unnervingly smooth and silent. It was toying with me, savoring my fear, but I could see its frustration in the way it flicked its head, as if uncertain of how to deal with my newfound resolve. For a moment, I allowed myself to look beyond the creature, to take in the surroundings of the cave. The strange markings on the walls, the oppressive darkness that felt alive, all of it seemed to pulse with an energy that was as ancient as it was terrifying. But in that moment, I understood. This was not just a fight against the creature, it was a battle for my own soul. And I wasn't about to let fear take it from me. I squared my shoulders, my posture more confident now, my thoughts sharper. The creature's eyes flickered with something, recognition, perhaps, or the growing realization that I was no longer the scared, vulnerable man who had first entered the cave. I had confronted the terror inside of me, and now I was prepared to face the terror that awaited me in the shadows. The whispers, the visions, the oppressive weight on my mind, they began to lose their power over me. The creature's influence could no longer reach as deep into my thoughts. I was taking control. I wasn't just a victim of the cave's horrors. I was its equal, standing firm in the face of something far older and more terrifying than I had ever known. In that moment, I knew what I had to do. It wasn't enough to confront the creature. It wasn't even about defeating it. I had to break its hold on me, shatter the illusion it had created. I had to remember who I was. I had to reconnect with the part of me that was still human, still capable of rational thought, still capable of standing up against the darkness. I took a step forward, the rock still gripped tightly in my hand. The creature hissed, its eyes narrowing, but I didn't hesitate. With every step I took, I felt the weight of its power begin to falter, its grip on me loosening. The whispers that had once filled my mind grew fainter, fading into the background like distant echoes. I was no longer afraid. The creature was nothing more than a shadow now, an illusion cast by my own fears. As I advanced, the creature backed away, its form rippling and distorting, as if uncertain of how to deal with my defiance. The power it had once held over me was slipping away, unraveling thread by thread. I had faced my fear and overcome it, and in doing so, I had found my strength. With one final, decisive step, I moved toward the creature, raising the rock high. It let out a shrill, inhuman scream, and with that, it vanished, retreating back into the dark recesses of the cave, leaving me standing alone. The cave fell silent. The oppressive weight lifted, and for the first time since I had entered, I felt the air in my lungs fresh and clear. I was victorious, not because I had defeated the creature, but because I had defeated the fear that had controlled me. And in doing so, I had grown. The cave stretched before me like a living thing, its walls jagged and pulsing with an unnatural energy. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, every breath feeling heavier than the last. I stood at the edge of the darkness, my fingers twitching nervously around the flashlight that barely illuminated the walls in front of me. This wasn't the beginning of a hunt, not anymore. The hunt had already begun the moment I stepped into these woods, but now it had escalated into something far more personal, something that I hadn't been prepared for. The creature, whatever it was, had made its presence known in a way that no rational explanation could ever satisfy. It wasn't just an animal. It wasn't just a monster. It was something older, something that seemed to feed on the fears of those who crossed its path. I had come here with the mindset of a skeptic, a lawman with a duty to investigate the unexplained. But that mindset had slowly begun to fracture. I no longer could dismiss the terrifying visions that danced at the edges of my perception, or the sense of dread that had clung to me since I had first set foot in the cave. The forest had its stories, stories of death, of strange disappearances, and I had always believed them to be exaggerated, the stuff of local folklore. But now, with each passing moment in this cursed place, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew. The darkness around me seemed to thicken with every breath I took, and the whispers, those ghostly murmurs that filled the space between heartbeats, grew louder, more insistent. They were subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but now they had gained clarity, sharp and distinct, like whispers in a crowded room, impossible to ignore. It was as if the cave itself was alive, feeding off my every thought, every breath, until I felt like I was being swallowed by it. I clenched my jaw and shook my head, trying to silence the voices in my mind. My training had taught me to block out distractions, to focus, to stay alert in situations where fear could cloud judgment. But this was unlike anything I had ever experienced. This was beyond my training. This wasn't just a case to be solved or a monster to be caught. This was something that challenged everything I knew about reality itself. I had to prepare myself. This wasn't just an investigation anymore. It wasn't about proving anything or finding evidence that could make sense of this nightmare. It was about survival. And for that, I needed to tap into something deeper. I needed to remember why I had come here in the first place, to uncover the truth, to find out what was truly lurking in the shadows of these woods, even if the answer defied every logical explanation. I pulled myself away from the edge of the cave, turning back toward the narrow tunnel I had just entered through. There was a brief moment of calm, as if the world had taken a deep breath with me. The whispers faded, the weight of the air lightened, and for a fleeting second, I felt like I could think clearly again. I had to stop doubting myself. I had to stop letting the fear and uncertainty control me. In this place, the line between fear and reality was razor thin. I thought of my training, the countless hours spent in dangerous situations, the years I had spent unraveling the complexities of human behavior. Those tools had been invaluable, yes, but now I realized something. This was different. This wasn't a case to be solved with logic or law enforcement tactics. It was something primal. And to face it, I needed to shed my skepticism, embrace the unknown, and confront this creature head-on with a clear mind. I checked my gear once more, ensuring my flashlight was working and my weapons were within reach. My gun felt heavy but comforting. But deep down, I knew I would need more than that to survive. It wasn't just the creature I had to worry about. There was something in the very fabric of the forest itself, a presence that I couldn't yet understand, but that I could feel in my bones. The cold that clung to my skin, the echoes of footsteps I wasn't sure were my own, it all felt wrong. I moved deeper into the cave, my senses heightened, every rustle, every drip of water from the stalactites above now a potential threat. The world was a blur of shadows, every corner hiding something unknown, something dangerous. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing glimpses of walls covered in cryptic carvings, symbols I didn't recognize, markings that seemed to be watching me, mocking me. The air grew colder as I went further, each step carrying me closer to the heart of the unknown. As I ventured deeper into the cave, the silence that had followed me began to grow heavier. There were no more sounds of animals, no breeze stirring the leaves outside, just the oppressive quiet that seemed to stretch on endlessly. The whispers were louder now, not in my head, but coming from the very walls around me. I tried to rationalize it, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was overpowering. I checked my radio, but the signal was dead. My heart raced in my chest as I turned around to retrace my steps. The path that had been clear moments ago now seemed completely different. Nothing looked familiar anymore. The walls, once rough and jagged, had become smooth, almost polished. The ceiling was lower, pressing down on me, and the air felt thicker, like it was harder to breathe. It was as if the cave itself was changing, shifting, trapping me inside. This wasn't just a natural cave. This was something older, something with an intelligence of its own. And that's when I realized that the locals hadn't been telling me ghost stories or folklore. They'd been telling me the truth. Whatever lived in that cave, whatever force controlled it, wasn't human. It wasn't anything I had ever encountered in my career as an investigator. It was something far older and darker, something that had existed long before the first settlers arrived in Ohio. As I pressed forward, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, I began to see shapes moving in the shadows. Not just shadows themselves, but things, creatures, maybe lurking just out of the corner of my eye. I couldn't make out their exact form, but I could feel their presence. They were there, watching, waiting. And then I heard the growl. It was low at first, just a rumble in the distance, but it grew louder, closer, until it was right behind me. I spun around, gun raised, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the oppressive darkness and the growing sense that I was no longer alone. The more I explored the cave, the more I realized that it wasn't just the environment that was dangerous. It was the very air, the darkness, that had a malevolent presence. This cave, this place, was alive in a way that defied every scientific explanation I knew. And I wasn't going to survive it. The deeper I ventured into the cave, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It wasn't just the physical darkness that suffocated me. It was the feeling of something ancient and malignant stirring beneath the earth. As an investigator, I prided myself on being rational, relying on logic and reason to solve the mysteries I encountered. But nothing in my years of police work had prepared me for what I was facing now. This wasn't a simple case of disappearances or criminal activity. This was something else, something far more dangerous and inexplicable. I had come to Wayne National Forest with a skepticism that bordered on arrogance. I believed the rumors surrounding the Cave of Killers were exaggerated, built up by locals who had let fear and superstition cloud their judgment. But now, as I stood at the mouth of the cave, it was clear that this wasn't just a tale spun out of fear. There was something here, something real, that the locals had been trying to warn me about. The air around me seemed to thrum with an unnatural energy, and every instinct I had as a trained investigator screamed at me to turn back. But I didn't. I couldn't. As the hours passed, the feeling of being watched intensified. At first, it was a vague sensation, like the brush of eyes on the back of my neck, but soon it became more tangible. I would hear the crunch of gravel behind me, but when I spun around, there was no one there. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, seemed to echo in the narrow tunnels. My flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls that twisted and distorted, making it impossible to tell where the real shadows ended and the illusions began. I had always believed in the power of the mind to play tricks, but these sounds, these sensations, were too vivid, too persistent to ignore. I started to question whether I was still in control of my own mind. The fear that had once been a quiet whisper in the back of my mind was now a loud, pounding voice, urging me to leave, to turn around and escape before it was too late. But I pressed on. There was a job to do. I had come to find the truth, and I wasn't about to back down because of a few disturbing sounds or unsettling shadows. I was trained to face danger head-on. I wasn't afraid of some old cave. Or at least, I told myself I wasn't. But as I navigated deeper into the twisting corridors of rock, the cave seemed to warp and change in response to my presence. The walls became smoother, slick with some kind of moisture that made it difficult to maintain my grip. The further I went, the more the tunnels felt as though they were closing in around me, squeezing me tighter with each step. The air grew thicker, colder, as if the cave itself were exhaling a breath that didn't belong in this world. I began to feel a creeping sense of vertigo, as though the ground beneath me wasn't quite solid. I checked my radio again, but it was still dead. I had lost all contact with the outside world. The team I had left behind was likely wondering where I was, but I couldn't help them. I was alone now. As I descended further, I stumbled upon the first of the remains. It was a piece of clothing, caught on a jagged rock formation. A torn sleeve, stained dark with blood. My stomach lurched, and I instinctively reached for my weapon. But there was no immediate danger. Only silence. The sight of the torn fabric, the bloodstains that still hadn't been washed away by the slow drip of water in the cave, filled me with dread. This wasn't a simple wilderness accident. Someone had died here, and worse, someone or something had taken them. I tried to make sense of it. I told myself that it could be a hiker or a hunter who had gotten lost, someone who had met with an unfortunate end. But the blood, the shredded clothing, it didn't fit the scenario of a tragic but explainable disappearance. It was too methodical, too violent. This wasn't just the random death of an individual lost in the woods. This was something far more deliberate, far more personal. As I continued down the passage, I began to find more signs of the violence. Pieces of torn gear, discarded weapons, a broken boot. These were the signs of someone being hunted, dragged through the cave by a force that wasn't human. The deeper I went, the more the sense of something being alive in the cave intensified. The ground beneath me felt alive, as if it were shifting beneath my feet, pulling me deeper into the labyrinth. And then I saw it. In the dim light of my flashlight, I caught sight of something moving in the distance. At first, it was a mere shadow flickering in the corner of my vision, but as I focused, I saw the silhouette of something massive, too massive to be human, sliding along the cave walls. It wasn't walking. It was slithering, dragging itself across the rocks with a fluid motion that sent a chill down my spine. The shape was impossible to make out, its form constantly shifting in the flickering light. It wasn't like anything I had ever seen before. It wasn't animal. It wasn't human. It was something else. My heart raced as I pulled my gun from its holster, my finger trembling on the trigger. I had no idea what I was dealing with, but I wasn't about to let whatever it was take me down without a fight. I raised the weapon, but the figure in the shadows disappeared, vanishing into the dark recesses of the cave before I could fire. I had no idea what kind of creature, or force, was lurking in the cave with me, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't going to let me leave. As the days dragged on and the situation in the cave grew more and more inexplicable, I began to realize that the mystery I was investigating wasn't just about the killings. It was about something far deeper, something rooted in the very essence of the cave itself. What had started as a straightforward case had evolved into a dark enigma, with tendrils stretching back into history, perhaps even beyond human understanding. I began to reflect on the local legends that the people from the nearby towns had shared. There were whispers of strange happenings in the woods surrounding Wayne National Forest for as long as anyone could remember. The tales varied, but the core remained the same. The cave had been a place of darkness, a place where evil thrived, and where it was better not to ask too many questions. Most of these legends spoke of a malevolent force that preyed on those who dared to enter the cave, and I had dismissed them as simple folklore, a product of superstitions and fear. But now, standing in the midst of the very place these stories had warned me about, I couldn't deny the creeping sense that something ancient and dangerous lay hidden in the depths of the cave. It was also the little things, the clues that didn't make sense, that began to gnaw at me. There was no sign of any rational explanation for the deaths of the adventurers who had gone missing in the area. They were like the hissing of 1,000 voices, all speaking at once in a language I couldn't understand. Yet the tone was unmistakable. It was a warning. I wasn't welcome here. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my knuckles white, my heart pounding in my chest. I was preparing myself for what was to come, preparing myself for the inevitable encounter with whatever force had claimed this place. I had thought myself prepared, but now, standing on the precipice of the unknown, I wasn't so sure anymore. It was then that I saw it. A flicker in the darkness ahead, too brief to be a shadow, but unmistakably there. My breath caught in my throat. It was the first time I had seen it clearly. Whatever it was, the thing that had been stalking me from the moment I stepped into the forest. I didn't know what it was, but I knew that I was its prey. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. This was the moment I had been dreading and anticipating all at once. The moment that would either break me or make me stronger. There was no turning back now. The creature stood before me, its shape barely discernible in the dim light, but I could feel its presence, its hunger, pressing down on me like a physical weight. The cave, which had once seemed vast and empty, now felt like it was closing in. My flashlight flickered weakly, casting a pool of light that barely reached beyond the tips of my boots, leaving the rest of the cave shrouded in darkness. A low growl reverberated through the air, sending a jolt of fear straight to my core. It was a sound I had never heard before, deep and guttural, not from any animal I could identify. The air around me grew colder, and I could see my breath in front of me, visible as a mist in the beam of my flashlight. I held my ground, forcing my body to steady itself despite the terror swirling inside me. I had to confront whatever this was. It was why I had come here, why I had walked into this place with a gun and a badge. But now, as I faced it, as I felt the weight of its malevolent stare, I realized that all the training, all the experience in the world, didn't matter. This was something outside of my understanding. I could hear its movements, slow, deliberate, like a predator playing with its prey. It was circling me, and I was acutely aware of every scrape of its claws against the stone floor, every breath it took. My mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of information I had gathered, the old folklore and rumors that had been told by locals, stories of strange creatures lurking in the shadows, of unnatural beasts stalking the forest for centuries. The growling stopped, replaced by a heavy silence, thick with tension. My heart pounded in my chest, and every instinct told me to run, but my legs refused to move. I stood frozen, knowing that fleeing would only invite the creature to chase me, and that would be the end. If I was going to survive, I had to face it. A sudden movement to my left snapped me back to reality. I swung the flashlight toward the noise, the beam catching the creature in a fleeting moment of clarity. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, its body covered in matted fur and patches of rough, scaly skin. Its eyes glowed a fiery red, and its mouth was lined with rows of sharp, jagged teeth, dripping with saliva that sizzled as it hit the cave floor. It was an abomination, a twisted fusion of man and beast, but far more terrifying than any nightmare I had ever imagined. In that instant, the creature lunged. I didn't have time to think, only to react. I fired my weapon, the shot echoing through the cave, but the creature was too fast. It dodged the bullet with a fluid grace that defied its size, and in one swift motion, it swiped at me with claws that could slice through stone. I barely managed to leap back, the claws grazing my arm and leaving deep, burning gashes that screamed with pain. I stumbled, but I didn't fall. My mind was racing, trying to process what was happening, what this thing was, and how I was supposed to survive it. My flashlight slipped from my grip and rolled across the floor, the beams scattering erratically before fading to darkness. Now, I was completely blind. The creature growled again, a deep, bone-rattling sound that reverberated through the walls of the cave. I could feel its breath on my skin, hot and foul. It was closing in. I cursed under my breath, fighting the panic that was threatening to overtake me. The pain in my arm was overwhelming, but I had to focus. There was no escape. This thing was relentless, and if I didn't do something now, I wouldn't make it out alive. I reached for my backup weapon, a knife I kept strapped to my leg, and gripped it tightly. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I wasn't about to die without a fight. I waited, listening for the sound of movement. The creature had paused again, as if savoring my fear. I could hear its heavy breathing, its claws scraping against the cave floor. Then I heard it, the sound of it moving toward me, slower this time, almost cautiously. I took a deep breath and tightened my grip on the knife. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, like a shadow pressing against me, always just beyond my reach. It was hunting me, toying with me. I had to strike first. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I spun around, slashing blindly with the knife. I felt the blade connect with something soft, and the creature shrieked, an unearthly sound that sent shivers down my spine. The thing recoiled, giving me a moment of precious space. My heart raced in my chest, and for the first time since stepping into this hellhole, I felt like I might actually have a chance. But the creature wasn't done. It roared, a furious, deafening sound that reverberated through the cave, shaking the very ground beneath me. It charged at me once more, faster than I could react. This time, I wasn't quick enough. The impact was violent. I felt the weight of the creature slam into me, knocking the breath from my lungs and sending me crashing against the stone wall. My vision blurred, and I struggled to regain my bearings. The creature loomed over me, its claws raised, ready to end it all. But then something changed. I don't know if it was instinct or desperation, but I managed to push myself up just enough to grab the creature's arm. It was hot, almost searing, but I held on, digging my fingers into its skin as the creature roared in pain. I saw the knife on the ground, inches from my outstretched hand, and in a desperate motion, I reached for it. With a final, primal cry, I plunged the knife into the creature's side, deep into its flesh. It howled, thrashing violently, but I didn't let go. I twisted the blade, using every ounce of strength I had left. The creature bucked, but slowly it began to weaken. Its growls turned to whimpers, and its movements became sluggish. Finally, with one last strangled scream, the creature collapsed, its massive body crashing to the floor. I lay there, panting, my body aching with exhaustion and pain. The world seemed to spin around me, and for a moment, I thought I might lose consciousness. But I had done it. The creature was dead. But I knew the truth. This was far from over. There were others. And I was no longer just a skeptic. I was part of a world that I couldn't escape. I stood slowly, my knees buckling as I pushed myself upright. I looked down at the creature's lifeless form, a shudder of realization creeping down my spine. I had won for now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just uncovered the tip of an iceberg. The worst was yet to come. I stood over the lifeless form of the creature, my heart still hammering in my chest, my breathing shallow and ragged. The cave was eerily silent now, the tension that had gripped me moments before dissipating, leaving a strange, unsettling stillness in its wake. I had killed it, the beast that had haunted the whispers of this forest, the one responsible for the disappearances and horrors, lay before me, its monstrous form now nothing more than a reminder of the darkness lurking beneath the surface of this world. But even as I looked at the creature's body, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't truly defeated it. Yes, it was dead, but something deeper still tugged at me. The horrors I had witnessed, the unnaturalness of what I had encountered. It wasn't a single, isolated event. There was a force here, something ancient and powerful, a malevolent presence that had been lurking in these woods for longer than I cared to imagine. I thought back to the other disappearances, to the rumors that had circulated among the locals. People spoke of strange occurrences in the forest, sights and sounds that didn't belong, creatures that couldn't possibly exist, and something even darker that was pulling the strings behind it all. The creature I had just fought, while terrifying and undeniably dangerous, felt like one piece of a much larger puzzle. From my professional experience, I knew that every crime scene had its patterns, its motives, and its logic. But here, in this cave, everything was out of place. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, no forensic evidence that would help piece together a typical story of violence. The bodies, or what was left of them, seemed to have been moved as if something, or someone, had played with them in a manner that was not just sadistic but almost ritualistic. The locals had been clear when they spoke about the cave. They didn't talk in vague terms. They spoke with a certain certainty in their voices. Some had even claimed that the cave was a doorway to another world, a place where the laws of nature didn't apply. Some spoke of dark rituals, strange symbols carved into the cave walls, and sightings of figures that didn't seem to belong to this world. I had dismissed all of this as nonsense. After all, I was an investigator, not a believer in myths and legends. But now, after seeing the signs and the horror that had unfolded before me, I wasn't so sure. My skepticism, however, wasn't easily shaken. I couldn't bring myself to believe that there was some otherworldly force at work. Not at first, anyway. Instead, I tried to ground myself in what I knew: psychological factors, potential criminal activity, or even a serial killer who had made this cave their hunting ground. But every time I tried to focus on the logical aspects of the case, the reality of what was happening in the cave shifted. Every logical explanation seemed to break down, and I was left with only more questions, more confusion. As I descended deeper into the cave, I began to notice patterns that didn't fit the explanation of a lone predator, a murderer using the cave as a hiding place. There were symbols, strange, cryptic markings that appeared on the walls, markings that didn't belong to any language I recognized. They were intricate, drawn in a style that seemed far older than anything that should have existed in this region. They were disturbing, even hypnotic, and as I studied them, I felt a strange pull, an impulse to continue deeper into the darkness. My rational mind screamed at me to stop, to focus on the task at hand, but something else inside me, something primal, urged me to move forward. The complexity of the situation grew with every step. I was no longer just chasing the person, or whatever it was, that had been committing these murders. I was now entangled in something much larger, something that I couldn't comprehend. And yet, there was no turning back. The pull of the cave, its strange power, had taken hold of me. In addition to the physical danger, I began to experience other shifts in perception. My time in the cave seemed to distort, the hours passed in a blur, and I had trouble keeping track of how long I had been there. It was as though the cave itself had no respect for time, and I could feel its disorienting effect taking root. I also began to experience strange hallucinations, fleeting images of people I had never met, faces twisted in fear, reaching out to me for help. The voices, those whispers I had heard earlier, grew louder, calling my name, begging me to understand. The deeper I went, the more I became convinced that this was no ordinary cave. There were also memories, strange flashes of memories that didn't belong to me, memories of other lives, other people who had been here before. Had they encountered the same darkness I was facing? Or had something far worse happened to them? These visions, if that's what they were, came and went, each one leaving me with a sense of dread, and the feeling that I was merely the latest in a long line of souls drawn into this cursed place. By now, I had no illusions about the situation. I was no longer just investigating a crime scene. I was now part of something much bigger, something that transcended anything I had ever understood. The cave wasn't just a location, it was a place of power, a nexus where dark forces gathered. I had thought I was in control, but I now realized I was just a pawn, lured into the game by forces beyond comprehension. What made matters worse was the feeling of isolation. My team, my colleagues, had no idea where I was. I couldn't even contact them. They were outside, waiting for me to return, unaware of the horrors that were unfolding inside the cave. I was cut off, alone, with nothing but the darkness, the whispers, and the sinister presence lurking just beyond my sight. The cave had its grip on me now, and there was no way out. It was hard to pinpoint the exact moment when everything changed. But there, in the deepest part of the cave, I realized that I wasn't alone. No longer was I just a skeptic, walking through the shadows of history and myth. Now, I was part of the story, trapped in a nightmare that had started long before my arrival and would likely continue long after I was gone. The air in the cave grew thick as I descended further, each step feeling heavier, as if the very earth itself was pressing down on me. The weight wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, a pressure that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The darkness felt almost alive, and with every flicker of my flashlight, I saw shapes move in the corners of my vision, familiar yet entirely alien. I thought I heard footsteps behind me, faint but deliberate, as if someone, or something, was mirroring my every move. But when I turned around, there was nothing, only the oppressive silence. I was nearing the end of the tunnel I had been traveling down, the passage narrowing until it seemed that no human being could have passed through it. As I inched forward, the walls seemed to close in, and I began to feel an overwhelming sense of dread. The markings I had seen earlier had become more frequent, their lines more intricate, their meaning impossible to decipher. It was as if they were alive, pulsing with a rhythm that I could feel in my bones. I could sense something darker at work, something far more malevolent than just a simple killer. And then I found it, the thing I had been searching for. At first, it seemed like just another symbol, another set of twisted lines carved into the stone. But as I stepped closer and shined my light on it, I felt my heart freeze. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a doorway. The mark on the wall was part of a larger design, and it seemed to have been deliberately made to guide me, to pull me closer to something. I leaned in, instinctively reaching out to touch it. As soon as my fingers made contact with the cold stone, a sudden jolt shot through me, a sharp, electric shock that seemed to travel straight through my spine. I yanked my hand away, but it was too late. The world around me began to shift. The air grew colder, and the sounds of the cave seemed to fade into a hollow, echoing hum. The ground beneath my feet trembled, and the walls pulsated as if they were breathing. And then, from the shadows, it emerged. At first, it was just a silhouette, its shape barely discernible in the dim light. But as it moved forward, I could make out its features. Pale skin stretched tight over its skeletal frame, eyes glowing with an unnatural light, and a mouth that opened impossibly wide. The creature's presence was suffocating, and I could feel the very air around it being sucked into its form. It was something beyond human, something that had no place in this world, and yet it stood before me, tangible, real, and terrifying. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. My first instinct was to run, to escape from the nightmare unfolding before me, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as though the cave itself had locked me in place, holding me captive, forcing me to witness the creature's arrival. I had spent years dismissing the legends of Wayne National Forest, convinced they were mere stories spun by superstitious locals. But now, standing face to face with this thing, I couldn't deny the truth any longer. The stories weren't just myths. They were warnings. The creature stepped closer, its eyes never leaving mine. It was as if it was studying me, measuring me in a way that sent shivers down my spine. I had always prided myself on my ability to remain calm under pressure, but in that moment, every ounce of my training, every lesson in resilience evaporated. I felt like a child, helpless and small, in the face of an ancient, unstoppable force. The creature opened its mouth again, but this time no sound came. Instead, I felt something of force, a pressure, pressing against my mind, invading my thoughts. Images began to flood my brain, flashes of horrific scenes, of suffering and death. Faces of people long gone, their expressions twisted in pain and fear. The creatures that had lived here before, the ones who had shaped the dark history of this place, and the others, otherworldly beings who had made the cave their home.